Hello, welcome back to Web Development. So in this session, our goal is to develop a simple HTML form. So this won't be a comprehensive overview of forms because forms are very much connected to backend languages. When we start to send information from the form to the backend, to the server, and so on, that's where we need a little bit more understanding about backend programming or server-side programming to move on our understanding of forms. So what I want to do in this tutorial is just give you the basics so you understand how to build a form, some of the attributes that are needed, and how to potentially then submit a form. The form is a very popular feature on just about any website that has a login or some sort of sign-up page. Maybe it's an e-commerce store. So a form is present just about everywhere. So in order to make a form, we need to use the form tags. And inside of our form tags, we're going to find a few different things. So inside of our form, we're going to have a label. This is basically the name of the form that maybe appear above the input field. And then we have the input element or tag. So notice that the input doesn't have a start and close tag. So let's start off adding some attributes to the label. So an attribute we might want to include is for equals. And then this is going to include the ID of the input. So let's just add an attribute to the input ID equals. And then we call this A and A. Now in the label, we want to add first input, for example. So this is going to be the text that appears above the input. So let's have a look to see what that looks like. There we go. Of course, what we can do is we can style this input to appear below. At the moment, because we're not using style sheets, we can just use the BR tag. So if I type a BR there, remember we don't need to open and close it. You can see it then drops below the label. So let me first just remove this for an ID just to show you. So if I save that and go back here, if I click on where it says first input, notice that it just tries to highlight the text. Now, if I go back and just add back that piece of code, the for, and then link it to the ID, go back and refresh. When I click on first input, notice that now the cursor appears in the input form and I can type something in. So there we go. You now understand the reason why you might use the for and connect it to the same ID of the input so that when you click on the text, you can then also enter text within. So other attributes that you're going to see inside of the input tag or element is the type. So type equals, and then we define the type. So here we have, for example, text. So there are multiple attributes we can apply here. So let's just go back to including this. We can see the list here. So button, checkbox, color, date, and so on. So these are all the different attributes that we can apply. We obviously used text. We can find that again. Can't see it. Okay, I'll just add it in. Text. But there are others. So the default is text. So if we didn't have type text, sorry, the default is a text. But what other things we might include in here? For example, we might have number. So this will define a field for entering a number, for example. We might want an input for the month. So the type might be month, for example. If we wanted to make sure that this was an email, then we can use the attribute property email. So those are a few different examples that you might want to include in here. And of course, another one I just thought about, the date. So in the majority of cases, we want to also include the attribute name equals, and then provide it a name. So this is important when we are submitting this data and maybe sending it to a server. It just allows us then to capture this information using post or get. So that's a little bit advanced for now, but later in the course, we get to see that in action. Okay, so now let's have a look at the type radio. So if I wanted to make a radio button, so let's have a look at this. Input, type radio, ID, I've given it dog, name is an animal, value is dog. So here I've got a label underneath this time for dog. So I need to bind this label with this input through the for and the ID needs to be the same. And then I enter dog, finish the label, and then create a BR, a break. So this is what it looks like. There we go. We now got a radio selection. So it's important in this case, reason why the label is underneath is because this is just a piece of text. And if I do that, you can see that dog is now above the radio button. So it does provide some ordering by having the label underneath the input. So there was a new attribute here called value. So this example here, for example, we created a label and an input. If we were to submit this now to a server, well, the value of this label or this input would be whatever's in the input. Whereas here in this radio button, we're clicking a button. We don't type anything. Therefore, we need to attach a value to it. So if I were to submit a radio button, the value of it would be, in this case, dog. Imagine you had lots of buttons, dog, cat, snake, and so on. You want to also send that information to the server so you knew, or the server knew, what button you pressed on. Whereas, like I said, in the label input here, you type the value in the input, so you don't need to define a value attribute in the input. Okay, so now I've added a submit button. So input type is submit, and then the value is submit. So let's have a look now what that looks like. And you can see that the browser renders a button, and it looks like that. Of course, I could add a BR tag right there. And then go back, and it's under there, for example. So that's just an example of a submit button. Of course, if I press this button, nothing is going to happen because I'm not submitting anything. What I mean by I'm not submitting anything, I mean that I've not defined where I want to submit it to. So what would happen now, like I keep alluding to, this needs to be connected to a server or backend language. So it submits the data somewhere so the server can handle that data and process it. Of course, in this instance, we're just using HTML, just pressing submit. The data wouldn't be going anywhere. We wouldn't be able to handle that data in any way. However, imagine we did have, for example, a PHP server running, and we wanted to send this data to the backend so it could process it. Imagine this is a sign-up form. We want to now get the user signed up. So we need to send this data to a server so it can process the data, make a new user, username and password for the user, and then that allows then the user to log into the system. Now, in order to send this data, we need to tell the form where to send the data. And we can do that by using the action attribute. And then in here, we say where we want to send it. So, for example, register.php, for example. So that just tells the form when you press submit where to send the information to. So this would go to a PHP file called register.php, and then that would maybe be connected to a database and it would be able to process all this information. I can also control what happens when someone presses the form, or so when someone submits this form. So I can use the target equals. So let's just see this, target equals _ blank. So we press that, press submit. Obviously, we can't find the file, so that's not going to work. But these are just different parameters that we utilize later. So in here, we can also have, for example, so if this would open up a new tab, in your browser, we could also have, for example, _parent and _top. So those are other kind of values we can add in here. The default value is self. So, for example, when I submit this form, it's just going to load the page again. That's the target. Okay, so I've gone off a little bit of a tangent there, simply because I just wanted you to see or start to begin to see that this form is just the beginning. HTML is just the beginning. We need to then develop or connect this to a back-end service, a server-side scripting language, potentially Python, PHP, etc., in order to do something with it. But we've learnt the basics here of creating a form. So as I just said, we have developed a simple HTML form. We've looked at the different parameters, the elements that are required to do that. We've created a label and inputs. We defined data types, and there are many of them. So by all means, have a little research and look at all the different data types. We've looked at radio buttons, how they differ in that you need to add a value to it, because when you submit, the users don't type in something like they do with a normal input form. And then we've discussed the submit button. And I've alluded to or given you an idea or perspective of where that data might go and how it might be handled.